Hello, sword people. Welcome to the Sword Guy podcast. This is your host, Dr. Guy Windsor, consulting swordsman, teacher, and writer. Join me for interviews with historical martial arts instructors and experts from a wide range of related disciplines as we discuss swords, history, training, and bringing the joy of historical martial arts into our modern lives. I hope you enjoy this greatest hit episode of the show. You can find all the episodes at swordschool.com/podcast, and there's a direct link in the description to this episode's show notes. On with the show.
I'm here today with Joshua Wiest. Am I getting your name right?
Yeah. I mean, we have more of an anglicized version of it, and it's Wiest.
Wiest. Okay,
Yep.
I'll do that again. I'm here today with Joshua Wiest, who is an instructor at the Triangle Sword Guild, focusing on the fighting systems of masters Achilles Marozzo, Giovanni dall'Agocchie, Antonio Manciolino, and Camillo Palladini. That's a lot of Italians. He's also a successful tournament fencer and host of the historical martial arts podcast, L'Arte dell'Armi. So clearly something of an Italophile. Anyway, without further ado, Joshua, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Guy.
Whereabouts are you?
I am in Raleigh, North Carolina, in the United
Really?
States. Yeah.
I once got stuck in the airport there for about 9 hours.
Really?
I did.
Why?
I was living in Peru at the time, and this is when I was a teenager, and I forget if it was on the way to Peru or on the way back, but flights got cancelled and changed and moved around, and I ended up having to wait in Raleigh, North Carolina. Actually, Raleigh-Durham is the airport, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, the only reason I know that is because I was in it for 9 hours about 33 years ago.
And cursing Raleigh-Durham the entire time. It actually has, yeah. No, it's changed a lot. It's a lot nicer now. That's not as just like one terminal. It's they've built a new one and it's beautiful. So.
Well, they didn't do that in time. Not soon enough for me. I seem to remember sleeping on the floor. Great. But let's not be deterred by my one not so great experience at Raleigh. Is it a nice place to be?
Yeah, no, I mean it's a great city. It's sort of stuck between an equal drive to the mountains and an equal drive to the ocean. So you have convenience of basically exploring whatever you want to explore. If you're kind of a beach person, you have the beach, and if you're a mountain person, you can go hang out in the mountains. And the whole state is basically a deciduous rainforest. So it's beautiful. A lot of trees.
Lovely. Okay. So are you from there?
I am. Yeah. So my family's not originally from here. They're from the Midwest, but I grew up here. I've lived here my entire life.
Okay. So how did you get started in historical martial arts? I mean, is there a lot of that going on in North Carolina?
Yeah. So it's pretty funny. I'm an avid listener of your podcast, and I feel like a common theme that I've heard from your guests is that they started writing a book and they never finished it, or something along those lines.
Sure.
And I'm gonna add to your pile of like authors that never quite fulfilled that ambition. I was writing a book, a historical fiction novel, about Epaminondas, who's a Boeotian general right after the Peloponnesian War, and I was writing this one scene in the book, and he had basically been relegated back to. He had been removed from the Boeotian government and was forced to sort of like reinvent himself in this city when they had just overthrown the Spartans. And I got to this scene where he's working with Gorgidas to form the Sacred Band, and they are training these guys to use weapons. And I was like, I have no idea how to use any of these weapons. And I was like, I need to rectify this situation. This is a problem.
I couldn't agree more. Okay.
So I've always been a big, very passionate about history. It's not what I do for my profession. I'm a medical laboratory scientist and I work in a hospital, but history has always been my sort of driving force. And And so I decided I needed to do something about it. So I started doing some research. I looked into just doing Olympic fencing and or sport fencing, and I found a school, and then through that school I found a group of historical martial artists. I found the Triangle Sword Guild, and I actually started doing rapier first.
Okay, it's a good place to start.
It was, yeah, and it actually worked because my historical interest at the time, even though I was writing this book and doing a ton of research on, the sort of the Corinthian War period of Greece, I I was also at the same time reading Peter Wilson's 30 Years War book, and which is a fantastic book. And so I was doing this deep dive on the 30 Years War and reading about the 80 Years War, and learning rapier at that time was perfect. So I got into that, and then our rapier program basically ground to a halt. And in its place, a new instructor came in and started teaching Bolognese, and the rest is history. I just kind of stuck with it.
Okay. So you were learning rapier to get insight into ancient Greek warfare. That's interesting.
Well, so
interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So let me clarify. So at the time when I started, the way that TSG handles their beginner classes for two-handed sword, for a long sword, which is what I was going to be doing, is they basically do blocks where they'll open up beginner classes like every 2 months, just because there is a lot of interest in the area. So to keep the beginner classes at a reasonable size that they can work with, they keep them in 2-month blocks. So I was waiting for one of those blocks to open, and I did start two-handed sword. They actually created a class on a Thursday because I worked weekends at the hospital, so all the weekend classes I couldn't take, but the weekday classes are what I was trying to sort of fit into. And so I did do a little bit of KDF for a while, but then that class kind of fell through. One of our instructors that was teaching that class ended up having surgery. And so I really, at that point, I was just sort of pigeonholed into the Bolognese system, which was, fateful.
Okay. Lots to unpack there, because actually, thinking about it, with the Bolognese sources, you do get shields, courages, bucklers, polearms.
Yep.
Right? So it's probably closer to being useful for doing your Peloponnesian War stuff than Kunstfechten would be.
Yeah, absolutely. As a matter of fact, the more I've gotten into the Bolognese system, the more I've heard, even from other practitioners, that there are times where either Marozzo or Manciolino are basically cosplaying the Greeks when they start using like partisan and rotella. I mean,
right, and I have a copy of the 1568 Marozzo.
Yeah.
Here, I have actually the 1568 one, like an original. Right.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, I could take it out and wave it to the camera, but the people listening can't see it, so that's not really fair. And it's got some very strange arms and armor in it.
Yep.
In the pictures, it's like, why on earth are they carrying out? And you're right, yeah, they're basically cosplaying the classical period.
They are. I mean, especially with Manciolino in particular, he goes on these long, like, humanist diatribes where he's throwing out all of the knowledge that he's sort of gained, and you think about the context of the time, writing and probably starting sometime in the early 16th century. It's kind of the height, sort of the tail end of the Italian Renaissance. And he's really just kind of like flexing his literary muscles, just like showing everybody that he's this like knowledgeable scholar of humanism. It's pretty funny. And it just kind of, it feeds that narrative, it feeds the narrative that he's just, some of this stuff, we're not really sure how practical it is, but, sure. Yeah. He's definitely cosplaying the Greeks.
Okay. So for the non-specialist listener, when they think Bolognese, they're going to think spaghetti. And we get this all the time. So could you just explain to the lay person, what is this Bolognese system we're talking about? Where does it come from? What is it about?
Sure. So the Bolognese system is basically something that we use to categorize a system of fighting because it uses common language. That's the best way to put it. There are a lot of very intelligent people who really kind of postulate that there's more of a northern Italian system, and then the Bolognese system just sort of exists within that framework. But the one thing that we have that unifies the Bolognese system and makes it easier for us to understand is that we have these 5 principal treatises that use the same language for the names of their guards, their cuts, thrusts, etc. And that's really what we sort of categorize as the Bolognese system. It exists for about 100 years, roughly, between really the start of the entirety of the 16th century is where we're kind of looking with the Bolognese system.
Okay, and where does it come from?
It comes from Bologna, Italy.
Okay, but I mean, okay, I'm hoping that even our lay people figure that much out. But
yeah, sorry,
it has antecedents with this Dardi or Bardi fellow.
Yeah, so Filippo Dardi is widely considered sort of the father of the Bolognese system, and then he has a prospective student, De Luca, who Marozzo says that like De Luca, more brilliant swordsmen came from the belly, or came from De Luca than Greeks came from the belly of the Trojan horse, is what Marozzo says about him, which is, you know.
Somebody will hopefully say that about one of us one day.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, I think
as instructors, that's what you want, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. But, you know, I mean, the Bolognese system, the cool thing about it is throughout this period, we have historical anecdotes, really because of the sort of the documentation of some of these fencing masters, that we have these stories of fencers, and Vigiani's a good source for that. But, you know, a lot of times these guys will start name dropping. So, you know, we've got, we've got Giovanni de' Medici, Giovanni della Bandineri, right? We have Guido Rangoni, who's sort of mentioned as a practitioner of the Bolognese system. He was a condottiere during the Italian wars. He's the person that Marozzo dedicated his treatise to. And then we have more people like Francisco Maria della Rovere, and Count Ugo. And
basically, we're talking, if you're into the Italian 16th century, we're talking about rock stars, effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Fiore does the same thing. He claims, for example, Galeazzo da Mantua as one of his students, and then goes on about how Galeazzo beat Boucicaut in a duel. Boucicaut being Marshal of France at the time, and so like top knight in Europe, if you like. So basically what Marozzo's doing is pretty much the same thing. It's like, these people think I'm cool, therefore you should too.
Yeah,
effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So, and that brings up an interesting point, because you kind of wonder, and this is something that I've thought a lot about. I feel like we get this prevalence of fencing treatises, or at least we see the development of systems after periods of long war. So with Fiore, for example, he's almost a contemporary of the great captains. Well, he is a contemporary of the great captains in the age of, you have John Hawkwood, and you have the Golden Company, and you have the White Company running around in Italy. And then you get Fiore, and you have the development of this system. And we see this system sort of developed and spread out throughout Europe. Well, not Europe, but Italy. I guess Europe, a little bit into Germany. But with the Bolognese system, it comes, we see the writings really kind of start in about the 1520s. We don't really know when the Anonimo Bolognese was written, but we know that with, at least from Manciolino and Marozzo, we can date those into the 1530s for their publication, and they come at the heels of the Italian wars. So we have these, this flowering of these ideas that really come and are born of conflict. Okay.
So, I mean, if I remember rightly, I think Manciolino book came out in 1531, wasn't it? Something like that. And he's sort of the first of the printed Italian sources.
Correct, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I actually was in an Italian bookshop about 6 years ago in Verona, and they had get this, they had a Manciolino, but it's worse. It's worse than that, right? I went in, and in Italian, I asked them if they had any historical fencing treatises, and they said, no, we don't. And so I gave them my card and said, if you find any, just, if you come across any, let me know, right? And later that night, at dinner, my wife and I are having dinner in a restaurant in Verona, just on the streets, because it's, summer and it's nice, and there we are. And this guy from the bookshop comes up, and he says, he was super polite. I think he called me Maestro Windsor, because he looked me up online. Oh, yeah, historical fencing teacher. Oh, that's really nice. He was super polite and nice. And he said, because he wasn't actually there when I was in the shop, his assistant was there. He said, we have a Manciolino. Are you here on Monday? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, no, we've gone home by then.
Oh, no. No.
So I didn't see it. And honestly, they were asking significantly more money than I had available for it. So I was never going to buy it anyway. But yes, I could at least have handled it.
There's actually a Manciolino for purchase right now, and they're asking for...
Is there?
Yeah, there is. They're asking for $7,000.
Where is it?
I found it on Goodreads. It's through an auction website. Yep.
Okay. $7,000.
$7,000. Mm-hmm. I know.
Oh, it would go so nicely with my Marozzo and
it
my
would,
Fabulous,
yeah. You gotta. I'm sorry.
Oh God. Okay. Yeah. Let me have a little think about that. Okay. I have 2 kidneys.
Yeah, exactly. So when I was on my podcast, when I was talking to Michael Chittister, I was really pressing Michael. I was like, listen, we need a facsimile of Marozzo. And he was like, look, if you can find a facsimile of Marozzo that has margin notes, I'll consider it. And so he's tasked the greater HEMA community to go out and find a Marozzo with margin notes, sort of like what he's doing with Joachim Meyer right now.
Yeah.
And in the process, he was talking about potentially doing a copy of Manciolino instead, because he likes Manciolino because it's tiny.
Yeah.
And
yes, it's tiny. It's a tiny little book.
Which I think it's kind of cool. Like I think it's great. It's like
it's a pocketbook. Yeah.
It is. It's a pocketbook. You just kind of put it in there, and
it's
and
like,
all this.
It's like 6 inches by 4 or something. I mean, it is really small.
Yeah, it's cool because he even has like really condensed advice that's just like really great stuff. Like,
hang on. You want a facsimile of Marozzo?
Yes.
Does it matter which edition?
No.
Okay. Well, I have high resolution photographs of not the first edition, but my edition, which is the 1568, and Malcolm Fair's copy of the 1540, the undated one.
Mm-hmm.
Producing a facsimile from those is not difficult.
Let's do it.
Okay. I honestly, I don't think the average listener will be terribly interested in the nitty-gritty of us discussing exactly how we would proceed with that.
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that some other time.
Maybe we'll chat about it after we've done recording. But in all seriousness, I mean, the data is there.
Yeah, no.
The process is just clean up the images, arrange them into a print file, add a sort of about this book page at the end. I mean, if you tell me there's a market for it, I could just get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, through my years of study, I've really come to the solid conclusion that if you're not reading a translation and comparing it to like the native language, the native Italian, and then comparing it again to like the actual text itself, then you're gonna miss things, because there's certain things that just are absolutely essential to really kind of like if you run into something that's hard to understand, a lot of times you have to start referencing the other source material and kind of build that out. So
well, my view is that if you're getting paid for your opinion, it should be based on the original.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's not reasonable to expect, amateurs in a club who happen to be teaching because they happen to be the most senior person present or the most experienced, and it's not their job, it's just something they do at the weekends and what have you. It's perfectly all right in that situation to be basing your interpretation on translations, right? Because learning the language is hard and it takes a long time and it's a tedious process, and personally I suck at it. But the reason I don't teach any German swordsmanship other than 133 is that I don't read German well enough, or at all in fact, to base my interpretation on that. 133 is a dodgy one because I am dependent on translation, but I have like 6 years of Latin at school, or 5 years of Latin at school, so I have just enough Latin that I can go in and have a little dig.
Yeah.
But that's an edge case. I probably shouldn't really be teaching 133 based on my own sort of principle of you should be able to read the original language.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I do like Fiore and Capoferro and some English sources and some French sources because I can read those, but I don't do the German stuff because I can't read German. And because this is my job, I feel if I'm teaching if I was teaching a Lichtenauer seminar, I ought to be able to read the original language, and I can't, so I don't.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just got done going on a sort of a deep dive and a study of Andrei Lignitzer. And I had to rely on the German speakers in our club and the people who could basically go in and take a look at the Middle High German and compare it to the translations that were available, which, I mean, there's some absolutely fantastic translations. Right. But it was actually really beneficial to go back in and look at the language, because like with Lignitzer in particular, he's got these situations where sometimes he'll use plurals for things instead of a singular when he's talking about shields. And in the German system, a lot of times they'll refer to sort of the lower half of the sword as the shield, and so he'll say something along the lines of Dirkwechsel underneath their schilts. Right, and he puts an S on there. But sometimes that gets lost in translation. You'd be surprised how many translations there are of Lignitzer where they forget that S. And so they just say Dirkwechsel under the shield instead of the shields, which changes the play significantly. So just a little anecdote.
Yeah. I've only published one translation, and that was of Vadi. And my first stab at it was shockingly bad. Unfortunately, it got picked up, and I did a second crack, which was much, much better, right? But it's astonishingly hard to do it well, and you are always making these sorts of decisions about, okay, we could translate it like this or like that, and there's nothing in this source to make it one way or the other, and so you're still always making these judgment calls. And that's the problem.
Yeah.
Languages aren't ciphers of each other. They're different ways of seeing the world.
Yeah, and that's why you just need somebody who has that context that can help inform you. I mean, I don't know. I got your I-33 class, your 133 class, and signed up for it.
The online course.
I did, yeah. So
brilliant.
So one of my pursuits that sort of came out of the pandemic was I started teaching sword and buckler, almost like an exclusive sword and buckler class. So in the framework of that class, one of the things that I'm doing is teaching from all the sources. So we run in, I think it's like 40 week cycles. So we'll do 40 weeks of Manciolino sword and large buckler, and then we'll do 40 weeks of 133 and Lignitzer. and Talhofer, because Talhofer is really simple.
He's got like 3 buckler plays.
Yeah, and then he's like, I've read, and then he actually mentions that he's read a treatise with a priest teaching these plays in Latin. So
does he say that? I wasn't aware.
Yep.
Oh my God, I need to reread Talhofer. It's been 20 years since I looked at Talhofer.
Well, so in a couple of the different manuals that he's put out, he mentions, so in 2 of them, I think in like the Württemberg, and then his personal manuscript. I don't know what the name of that one is. I just remember on Wichtenauer it's named his personal manuscript, so that's just what I go by. If it's good enough for Michael, it's good enough for me.
And we'll stick links to these things in the show notes so people can find them.
So he mentions that those 2 things are, like in those 2 treatises, he actually has sword and buckler plays, and he gives you about 6 roughly, in this like continuation, and some of them are kind of obscure. But then in his other treatises, he just has that sort of that name drop of having seen something with a priest, with sword and buckler. And he says that he understands it, which that's all he says. It's just like one picture and this block of text that says, I've seen this and I understand it, and that's it. So I don't know.
To be honest, I mean, it took me a while to get to grips with 133. I think I worked on it for about 6 months before I taught a class on it. But it's not a complicated system.
It's not, but it's brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has so much in common with all the other systems.
Yeah, when I was reading about your approach to it, I realized that we were following similar veins in terms of how we were understanding the approach of 133. And then I was like, okay, this is perfect. Because as much as I would love to dedicate a ton of time to really kind of developing my own system and understanding of 133, sometimes when you're focused in other areas, you can continue to focus in those areas and rely on the hard work of other people.
Right, absolutely. Like, I have a pretty solid grasp of the Lichtenauer material because friends and colleagues have taught me their grasp of it, and it's never going to be perfect. Of course it's not. But then if I did it myself, it wouldn't be perfect either.
Right.
So, but it's enough that it kind of informs and develops your understanding of your own specialization, and you don't end up getting siloed into this pathetically small little, I only do Italian long sword.
Exactly.
But yeah, this is normal academic. Well, I mean, you're a scientist, right? And the scientific stuff that you do is probably drawn from a lot of other people's work. Like, I mean, I don't suppose you invented all of the different reagents and tests and things that you do, did you?
No. I wish, but I know.
No. Right. So yeah. So using other people's work is like it's how we develop at a reasonable pace. I mean, if you have to invent everything from scratch, you're going to be stuck in the Stone Age for a very long time.
Exactly. Yeah. I agree.
Okay. Well, when you've done the course, I'll be interested to hear what you think of it.
Yeah.
So, you know, and you can be frank.
I will. I'll be honest. I promise.
Okay, so, all right, we've mentioned Vadi a couple of times. Just for people who may not be familiar, Vadi wrote a treatise in around 1480s for the Duke of Urbino, and it has a lot of commonalities with Fiore, and it may have some commonalities with some of the Bolognese stuff. And it is knightly combat. It's a manuscript, so it's not a printed source. There's only one copy of it that we know of, which is in the Biblioteca Nazionale di Roma, so the National Library in Rome. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with Vadi because as an Italophile, you pretty much have to be. But what do you think the relationship is between Vadi and the other sources? Sources?
About a year and a half ago, I got really frustrated with Marozzo's two-handed sword. So
I can understand that. I've looked at it. He's not very clear.
Yeah, and I was also, I started to kind of get this feeling that Marozzo in the way that he teaches the two-handed sword, I wasn't quite sure about the martiality of his approach. So oftentimes the Bolognese masters or writers will sort of identify the things that they think should be done in the saddle and the things that they think would be done with sharp swords in earnest. And so I wasn't quite sure how much of in earnest approach Marozzo was providing. And not that depreciates what he's teaching by any means, but it was more of trying to understand whether or not it was, and I've heard about this about Vadi too, where, Vadi's basically writing this forlorn love letter to the two-handed sword as it's fading out in its relevance. And is basically just kind of like, we don't know if he actually used it. And I kind of got a similar feeling about Marozzo, and I wasn't quite sure. So I decided to really start looking into it. And to do that, I needed to do two things, and that was study Fiore and study Vadi.
Right.
And so I started studying Fiore, and I'm actually working through Fiore right now. Again, co-opting ideas from other people. We have an instructor in our school, Kurt Holfeder, who is...
I know Kurt, yeah. He's had some private lessons with me, yeah.
Yeah. And he's a fantastic fencer. But, he's gone on this quest to really kind of understand and implement Fiore. And I've been working with him, and it's been fantastic because I'm starting to see all these like little similarities, these sort of things that provide these distant echoes of aspects of things where I'm like, could that be, and that's the scientific process, right? You start asking questions and you start wondering things and you start exploring, going down all these little rabbit holes to see if there's any sort of validity to what it is that you think, right? And that's really kind of what I've been doing. Like, does Marozzo call Guardia dei Entrari, where he's up in, for German people, it would be up in left flug, or you could say he would be in Finestra for the Fiore folks.
Ooh, I'm not sure Guardia di Entrare is Finestra. Oh, that's
it's not.
A contentious statement.
So, no, it's not Finestra.
It's definitely not Finestra.
And I'm talking in terms of just like what the guard looks like, right? In terms of like the posture.
But and I'm teasing you a little bit.
Yeah. So, but here's the thing. This is the rabbit trail that I went down. Is Guardia dei Entrari because Marozzo is basically trying to convey Colpo di Vigliano.
Why?
Because he's basically doing a hanging parry where he's coming up underneath, and then he has narrow stance, which is where you're just bringing your sword up, and if you look at the angle, he's got his sword all the way down, and then he's stepping out with his back foot, and then he's stepping in and closing.
Okay. 1 second, I'm just going to dig out my notes, and I'm going to have a look for myself. And I'll stick a photograph in the show notes so that the listeners can join in. Yes. There we go. Alright, Guardia di Entrare. Dove. Okay, this is my 1568. So it looks like you're going to have a look at it.
It's beautiful.
Anyway. It's nice, isn't it? I think it needs rebinding. It's got a 19th century binding on it, but the print's original. And in pretty good nick. Here we go. Okay. Guardia di Entrare non in largo passo, and we have Guardia di Entrare in largo passo. Which one are you referring to?
So I'm wondering if that's a continuation, right? So basically, he's the way that he uses Guardia di Entrare is usually going to be a way of parrying. So you're kind of getting up underneath somebody's sword, and the idea would be that you're entering because you're getting around to their outside line.
That's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just describe it for the listeners. So imagine if you're both right-handed and you're both coming from the right-hand side and the swords are crossed and your opponent is pushing your weapon quite strongly towards your right side. If you lift your hands and let the point drop, their sword flies off to the side and you get effectively a variation on Fiore's Colpo di Vigliano, as you said. So you're seeing it not as sort of a guard, but more as a waypoint.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So the reason it's the guard of entering is you're if you can get to somebody's outside line,
Right.
and you're sort of pressing the advantage, then you're going to have the availability control, because when you close to stretta from that place, you have all sorts of things that you can do. You can, from that outside line, you can push a thrust, you can go for a grapple, but it's a good way, it's a safe way of entering, because then you can turn their body too, right? You're starting to turn their hips away from you, and then you're closing in on them, so you're kind of refocusing.
That's interesting. Okay. So bringing that back to Vadi, what do you think the connection is?
So the reason why I think that Marozzo is I think Marozzo is co-opting ideas. I don't know how genuine he is in his just like development of this system, or if this is him co-opting ideas. Now, it kind of has to go back a little bit to a story about Marozzo. Okay. So, like when we talked earlier, we were talking about Guido Rangoni, right? And Marozzo in particular, he dedicates his treatise to Guido Rangoni, but Guido Rangoni was not the Lord of Bologna at the time when Marozzo was writing. So why would he write to Guido Rangoni? Because he probably had a personal relationship with Guido Rangoni. Because the Diestes at that time when Marozzo was writing had basically been given power from the Pope to be in charge of Bologna. The Rangone family had been removed from power in Bologna. And so the fact that he's writing to the son of a noble who's been removed from power in the city of which he's writing is pretty curious, right?
That is very curious, yeah.
But it kind of leads you to the understanding that there might be more to this, right? And so, again, the idea that these things are generally born of war, Guido Rangoni was a condottiere, and Marozzo calls himself a master of arms. And this is all speculative. I mean, there's nothing to prove any of this, but I would love to prove it, but that would be like a PhD level research. And I wish I had time to do it. But, with Guido Rangoni in particular, we know that he was pretty active in the Italian wars. There's actually Christopher Hare's book, The Romance of the Medici Warrior. It has this really awesome story, which is a book about Giovanni della Bandineri, where Giovanni della Bandineri's black bands ended up basically having to work alongside Guido Rangoni when Guido Rangoni was given the charge of protecting Italy right before the sack of Rome, right? So you have this German mercenary army that's coming down, that are unpaid and just literally just wreaking havoc and wrecking all of Italy, and so Guido Rangoni's given command to try to stop this attacking force, and Giovanni della Bandineri is basically acting as his sort of forward scout and harassing the Germans as they're coming down. But either way, in that, Giovanni della Bandineri it documents that Giovanni della Bandineri wrote a letter to a friend of his, and basically he just smack talks Guido Rangoni the entire time for having like these really undisciplined troops who didn't know what they were doing. They said they were fat and lazy, and like that that they were just awful, right?
Yeah.
And I thought that was great. But to bring this all back to Vadi, is that I think my estimation is that Marozzo probably was associated with Guido Rangoni in some way, and that's where he sort of got a lot of these ideas. And I think he's co-opting ideas where, if you look at his two-handed sword, he's even co-opting ideas from Pietro Monti. Like he basically does things that are the levata, right? Like if you look at his the second assault of the two-handed sword, he starts out by doing the levata. He says that you cut a falso dritto and then a falso manco, and he's, in my mind, that's what he's doing. And I know that other people have theories, and we've got this debate going on in the Bolognese community about what that actually is. But I think he's showing the levata, and I think he's co-opting ideas. I think he's pulling all these things together.
For the one or two people listening who have not read Pietromonte and memorized every word, there's only going to be a couple of them. What is the levata?
So the levata is basically where you throw a rising cut from like a, so it's a rising false edge cut. And so you kind of flick your hands over and snap the false edge of the sword at somebody's hands. So you throw these rising cuts and then snap the sword at their hands, and then you turn on the other side and you flick and snap the sword at their hands. So that's basically
it's a false edge rising cut from the right, followed by one from the left.
right.
And Pietro Monte calls that combination a levata.
Yeah, well, so that action, a levata. So he does the levata from both sides. But yeah, it starts
so either one of those would be a levata. Okay.
Yep. So it starts true edge and then it turns over at false edge. And so it's in that snap that you get that percussive action and that heavy rotation. And that's basically what Marozzo is doing. That's how he exits his plays. He does a levata to the hands, right? He's and I think that's really kind of how he proceeds to play in the second assault. So I see him co-opting a lot of ideas, and I think that he is co-opting ideas from Vadi. I think we see a lot of similar structures in the way that he's developing his guards, and sort of the tactical approach is relatively similar, and that's really what I'm trying to explore, and that's kind of the path that I'm on. So, working from Fiore now, probably in a year or so, I'll start getting into this real deep dive of Vadi, following Connor Kimcow's awesome book that he just put out on Vadi, where he's worked and done a lot of research on Vadi and the similarities of Vadi and countering Monte, and how there's sort of a connection between those two. And so I'll really start getting into a deep dive on that.
Okay, yeah, that came out just this year, didn't it? Yeah, I haven't read it yet.
The Light of Mars, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
So you would think that Marozzo would have seen a copy of Vadi's book?
I don't know. It's hard to say.
I don't. There's only one copy of it. It's not like everyone's read the Da Vinci Code, or everyone's at least seen a copy of it because it's bloody everywhere. There's like one known copy, and it would have been. It was probably. Was it in the Urbino Library at that point? No, it would have been nicked by Medici. No, not Medici. Sorry, Borgia.
Oh, Cesare?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, awesome. I love history.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
Yes, got a copy.
Yes. Oh, good. Okay. For people who didn't see that, I'm checking my own Vadi book.
Yeah.
Because I've written up a lot of this stuff in here, and if it was better organised, I would be. Where is it?
Yeah, you wrote a great essay about the similarities of Fiore and Vadi and Marozzo and the sort of the guards and everything like that. And I think that's really helped to pique my curiosity and kind of looking through these things to see,
Yeah, well, I'm glad you liked it. And one of the reasons I'm asking about it is, of course, I have my opinion. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it's likely that, because again, there would be one manuscript, it would have been in Cesare Borgia's library. It's unlikely that Marozzo would have had access to that, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And Borgia was dead by this point anyway. And so where was that book? Honestly, I can't remember. I can look it up. But if there was a kind of a vernacular of sword language and sword style, like if you look at lineages in sport fencing now, mm-hmm. they're all using the same terminology. They're all coming from a common source, but the way, I don't know, sabre is taught in Hungary is quite different to the way it's taught in Britain, is different to the way it's taught in America, is different to the way it's taught in France, and so on. So are we looking at a common system of which Marozzo would be a later dialect, or what do you think?
Yes, and I think that's more of what it kind of comes down to. And obviously Vadi, would Vadi have had availability? Well, I mean, he probably did have some exposure to Fiore, right? In some way, because he co-opts a lot of his ideas from Fiore.
Yeah, and he quotes him outright in some cases.
Yeah.
But then, hang on. Just because my mum sang "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" to me, and your mum sang "Twinkle Twinkle Little Star" to you, doesn't mean that we're related.
No,
It
for
just
sure.
means that there's this common song that mothers sing to children.
So, I mean, Marozzo, because the D'Este family and the Duke of Ferrara were, for the most part, in control of Bologna at the time when Marozzo was sort of developing his style and became the principal fencing instructor in Bologna. I don't know if he ever saw a copy of Fiore. We'll never know.
But the copy would probably not have been in Bologna.
No, definitely not.
The D'Este
Definitely
library
not.
would have been.
Ferrara.
There we go.
Yeah. Well, but there's nothing to say that he wouldn't have had.
Wouldn't have gone there.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Okay.
I mean, it's a ton of speculation and just kind of ideas, but looking to themes and ideas that sort of transcend, and is Marozzo in some way looking back and even looking at what was a common fencing system, sort of like what you said, like a common fencing system that existed in Italy. And is this something that was more prevalent than we really kind of realized? I mean, were there students of Fiore that, were like De Luca and had, more students than Greeks that came out of the Trojan horse? I mean, it's possible. It's possible that these ideas sort of disseminated and sort of transcended. And then you have Marozzo, who's basically taking these same ideas and providing the language of the Bolognese system, which is unique at its time, and basically changing the language to match the things that he already understood as a common system.
Yeah, possibly. And it strikes me that we are always dealing with a very restricted data set, because most fencing masters in the period did not write books, right? And the ones who did write books, there's no actual there's no process by which only the good ones are allowed to write books.
Yeah. Well,
right? And there's no fact checking, so they can say whatever they want, and they can absolutely traduce somebody else's system, or they can talk shit about other people, as they did. If I'm remembering rightly, Alfieri refers to Capoferro as Capo di Ferro, so which for non-Italian listeners would be, okay, Capoferro's name is Capoferro, which means iron head, right? Right? But Capo di Ferro means head of iron. In other words, thick. Right? That was deliberate. I mean, that was Alfieri being a dick.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Manciolino talks smack about... Well, we think that Manciolino is talking smack about Marozzo in his book, because they might have had some relationship. Again, this is all very speculative, but he talks a lot about
Marozzo.
He does, but they were both writing at the same time. There's a possibility that, and Michael Chidester actually just said something about this recently, that there might be, or maybe this is something that Matt Gallus researched, but there might actually be a copy of Marozzo that was originally published, I think, in 1525.
Oh, really?
Yes.
That would be very interesting.
They found woodcuts, and the date is different. It's not dated in the 1530s. The problem is that they only found the title page. So they found the woodcut with the title page, and the date is earlier than what we know.
Oh, wow. That is very interesting.
Yeah, so Marozzo...
It could be... Okay, think of Thibaut, right? Mm-hmm. Thibaut's fabulous book, The Academy of the Sword, right? The date on the title page is wrong, right? Because the book was like 4 years late coming out. So I think it's 1628 on the thing, but it was actually only published in 1632, something like that. I'm probably mangling the dates, but that's... So finding a plate saying 1525, it could just be that Marozzo was a very slow writer and overshot by about, I don't know, 13 years or something. Or,
given how labored Marozzo's writing is, it seems highly likely.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
or there is a book missing, but which has but if it's got plates, that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a printed book, because there is one copy of Capoferro that Roberto Gotti has, and bless him, Roberto Gotti is the man I got my copy of Fabris from, right? But he has a copy of Capoferro which has the plates printed onto the pages, but all of the text is handwritten. Right, and
wow.
I need to get myself to Brescia and have a proper look at that and figure out whether it is a presentation copy or whether it is the copy that got sent to the printers so that they could like set all the type. So it's like the original. So did Capoferro write it himself? Was it written by? I mean, there's lots and lots of questions there. But imagine if there's a Marozzo like that.
Oh,
a manuscript awesome. Marozzo with the woodcut plates from the first edition.
That'd be incredible.
Right. Or even earlier.
So, I mean, the general speculation, to kind of go back to that, is Marozzo talks a lot about money in his
he does.
In his treatise. I mean, he's writing it for his son. He's writing it for Sebastian.
8 Bolognese pounds for to learn the Zogolargo, something like that? Yeah,
something like that. And it comes out to like $100 a month to modern currency, $100 US. But, you know, and then Manciolino talks a lot about how you should disparage people who do nothing but talk about money when it comes to fencing.
Okay.
So, you know, whether or not that's true, it's fun to think about, and it's funny because, you know, it's fun to rag on Marozzo. It's fun to give him a hard time.
Yeah, that is fair. Okay. I have to ask, right. My absolute favourite 16th century Italian fencing treatise, without question, is Vigiani's Lo Schermo. Mm-hmm. Right? To me, it's like a Rosetta Stone of how Italian fencing works. Right?
Yep.
Okay, so for people listening, it was written in about 1551, 52. It was not published until many years after Vigiani's death. It was published in 1575, so it was about 25 years old when it was published.
Yep.
And it's in the form of a conversation between these 3 characters. Okay, so what are your thoughts on Vigiani?
Yeah, so I have to, first of all, I agree. It is the Rosetta Stone of most Italian fencing. And I think it should be required reading for everybody who fences, because his discussion of tempo and association with Aristotle is one of the most important things to understand if you want to understand European martial arts.
I'd agree.
Hands down.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
because, you know, you have these sort of 2 camps of people. You have camps of people who think that, you know, I guess isolationists, if you will, or people who take it more from a nationalistic perspective, where like they're like, no, Italian fencing is always different than German fencing, and they never co-opted any ideas. And then you have people who are like, oh no, there's no way. Like if you look at the continuation of history throughout Italy, you know, there are always Germans and, and Spaniards and French in Italy.
Yeah,
so of course they were borrowing ideas. And but if you really want to find something that unifies all European martial arts, it is Aristotle and Aristotle's physics, right?
Yeah.
So Vigiani gives the best breakdown of that and his discussion of tempo, and you can literally take his discussion, you can apply it to Lichtenauer, you can do you can apply it to the Bolognese system, you can apply it to rapier, you can push it into everything that you can possibly imagine. You can even push it into 133, right?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
So
I mean, okay, let me just do that for you. The very first words, right? Fencing is the ordering of blows, right? And then he gives you these 7 guards. So obviously he's referring to blows, but he shows you the guards because the guards are the beginning, the middle, the end of a blow. And he says all fencing actions end in langor, which is the 7th ward, right, with the weapon extended. So he's saying, okay, you start from these various different positions, like under the left arm or on the right shoulder or whatever, and you go into this long position, and those are the blows. that's what that page means, right? It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, that's Aristotle. That's Aristotle as understood by Vigiani, as Vigiani explains Aristotle's physics in terms as they apply to fencing tempo. That's exactly what he says.
Yep. And so for people who aren't familiar with the text or what he's kind of going for, the way that he basically describes it is, Aristotle says that time is the amount of the space in between two positions of rest, right? So if you're in a position of something traveling, so imagine like the Earth in orbit, right? We consider something a year when the Earth has completed its orbit around the sun, and that's 1 year, right? So that space, if you were to imagine that imaginary line, is the continuation of that space. So that's time. And so what Vigiani is sort of breaking down is he breaks this down into fencing terms, where tempo or time is the time, it's the space in between two positions of rest. So if you're in a high guard and you cut to Langort, for example, so you cut to a center guard, that space that the sword had to travel is the time. That's the tempo, and it's something that even in 3227A, it mentions that he mentions that Lichtenauer was aware of Aristotle. I can't remember the quote off the top of my head.
But shame on you, Joshua. I mean, come on. Have you
know.
not memorized the whole of 3227A?
Yeah, I think I pushed it out of my head. But yeah, so I mean, you have these things that just show up continuously throughout, and it's brilliant. I mean, it's a brilliant exposition of what this is. But to kind of take a step back with Vigiani in particular, and the reason why I really love Vigiani. So I had somebody had asked me to put together a lecture for what the approach to fighting was in the Bolognese system, and and so I was like, okay, yeah, I can do that. And so I started looking at the sources and really how they approach the fight, like from the start of the fight. And at the time, I was really starting to get into Palladini because I had just gotten my copy of Palladini. And Palladini gives a great exposition of how the fight should start, where, he says basically you should come up to your opponent, and once you're 2 steps away, you should start watching your opponent to see what position they're in, so that way you can come to the devices for how to basically foil their plans, right? And then once you've made a plan, he tells you that you should press your plan with abandon, essentially, which is interesting advice, right? And I kind of wanted to unpack that a little bit. So I used that as the framework to really kind of build out the approach to fencing that I was looking at. I started looking at all the sources and finding a lot of agreement between all the different masters, whether it's Manciolino, Marozzo, Vigiani, or the Anonimo Bolognese, and they basically all say that kind of the same thing, like to constantly change your guard. And I was thinking, okay, well, that's interesting. You don't see people do that a lot, where they're constantly changing their guard. But sometimes, we develop bad habits in HEMA that don't necessarily fit the historical precedent. Where
one thing that drives me completely batshit crazy is when you see 2 people who are supposed to be fencing each other with long swords, on the outside measure, sort of just going from guard to guard, pouncing around instead of getting in there and hitting their opponent. It drives me absolutely insane.
Well, which is funny because that's kind of what they tell you to do, but there's a level of intent for what they want you to do when you're assuming your guards. And that's what I was trying to figure out, like what is it that they're trying to convey where they're telling you to constantly change your guard, and why are they doing that? And so much of it is to disguise your intention as you're coming in. But there's obviously some, and this is something that, like in the Bolognese system, there's a lot of emphasis on guards because there are a lot of guards. Marozzo gives us 26 guards.
That's a lot of guards.
It is a lot of guards, too much. The dude needed an editor so bad. But the idea is that there is a lot of emphasis on guards and in these positions. And I started to realize that there's a tactical framework that sort of exists within these things. And at the time, I was still kind of holding the belief that, Viggiani was kind of a heretic. Because Viggiani goes on this, he goes on this spiel where, he's like, the Bolognese guards, they have stupid names. I'm going to give them more practical names. Yeah. And this is basically me reinventing the system.
He's not a heretic, he's a critic.
He is a critic, but he's also a brilliant conveyor of ideas. And this is where this kind of came in, because Viggiani was working with the court of the Holy Roman Emperor. He was tied in some way to Charles V, and then eventually published his manuscript posthumously. His brother published his treatise for Maximilian II, right? And so we're talking about him writing his treatise for the Holy Roman Emperor, which, that's a pretty big deal.
Pretty big deal.
Yeah, if I start writing a fencing treatise for the President of the United States, I've probably done pretty good things. Like, I've made a name for myself.
Okay, the whole thing about book dedications is worth going into, because in this period, these days you can dedicate your book to whoever you like, and it's just a dedication, right? Back then, if you dedicated your book to a person, you pretty much had to get their permission for it, because you like Fabris dedicated his book to King Charles, oh my God, I'll have to dig it out and have a look. Christian IV of Denmark, right?
Yep.
Right, and there's a picture of the king on the front of the book. I will dig it out and show it to you, because I happen to have a copy of Fabris. Right?
Oh, to be in your library, guy.
Well, dude, anytime you're in Ipswich, seriously, I'll sit you in an armchair and give you a Marozzo and a glass of wine, and you'll be fine. Christian IV. There's a picture of the man. Yep. If you put a picture of the king in the front of your book, giving the impression that he's approved it, and he hadn't, you are going to spend the rest of your life in a really nasty, smelly dungeon.
Yeah.
Right? And all of your books will be burned.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And if he really doesn't like you, he'll probably burn you with them. So okay. For non-specialist listeners, it's probably worth making that point that, okay, Viggiani can't just stick the king's name on the front of, or the emperor's name on the front of his book and expect to get away with it.
Yeah, there was some tie there. But the cool thing about it is, when you think about it in that context, Viggiani is explaining the Bolognese system to the court of the Holy Roman Emperor, and he's not writing to a knowledgeable audience. If I'm trying to convey an idea to a group of people and I need to basically translate things, they're not going to have the same natural feelings towards the names of the guards, where they're going to have a sense of familiarity or a sense of understanding, or maybe even the cultural context to understand why Coda Lunga Stretta means the guard of the long tail. And then you get this thing from the, I think it's the Anonimo, where he talks about why it's Coda Lunga Stretta.
Viggiani's.
Oh yeah, no, you're right. It is Viggiani.
It's long tail. An important person has a whole retinue.
That follows him around. Exactly. Yeah. And so you get this sort of description of what this guard is, and of course he explains it here, which jumbling that around. But the idea is that he's actually changing the names of the guards to convey the ideas, the tactical implications of each of the guards, and it is the most brilliant exposition that I have ever read, because
it's perfect.
It is.
Because it's absolutely logical, right? If your guard has the point forward, it is perfect.
Yes.
If it doesn't have the point forward, it is imperfect. Yep. Right? If it is chambered to strike, it's offensive, right? And
if it's low, it's defensive.
If it's low,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so it has this. So when he gives you the name of the guard, it's like first guard. Hang on.
Gordia.
I can edit out the bits. Let me see. I have the excellent. What's his name?
Jarek Swinger.
Jarek Swinger, yes indeed.
Yep.
I have his translation here somewhere, which is probably better to read from than. That's a grip. I've got his Agrippa is there. His De Grassi is there. He's prolific. His Marozzo is there. Where the hell is this Vigiani?
He is prolific.
Yeah, and I've recently moved everything around here, and I haven't actually reorganized the books. I've just
So
just sort of
I
shuffled
think
them wherever.
he starts with Guardia Offensiva Perfecta.
His first ward is up above the shoulder, isn't it?
Oh yeah,
His first ward is down here.
It's sheathed,
where it would be as if it was in the sheath.
Yeah.
So that's Difensiva Imperfecta, and then he swooshes it up, and then he's in
Offensiva
second ward, which is
Perfecta.
Offensiva Perfecta, because it's on the right side, it's above the head, the point is forward, and then third ward is when he turns it so the point is back, which is Imperfecta, and then he cuts down. The whole book is just genius.
It is.
And he has that tree, the tree of gods.
He does, which is beautiful, right? But
I'll stick a picture in the show notes so people can see it.
The thing about it is, like, reading in Manciolino, Manciolino gives this really interesting anecdote in his introduction. He says that, basically the low guards are good for defending, the high guards are good for attacking. And when you're in a low guard, your natural offense is always going to be a thrust, right? So I took that and I started really kind of delving into that further. And looking at Manciolino's offenses, basically with the sword and small buckler, which is sort of the framework of his system, and then he kind of builds off that into lots of different things. He constantly wants you to work back into it. So for his offenses, sure enough, when he's in Codalonga Stretta, or when he's in Porta de Ferro Stretto, so he's in his low guards, either on the right or the left, he either attacks with a thrust or with a falso. And then the secondary intention sort of builds off of that. So a falso would be usually to the hand. I mean, we're talking about sword and buckler here. But he limits it to just that. Whenever he's in a low guard, those are his basic actions, And the kind of the brilliance of it is, and Marozzo says this later on, is that when an opponent is in a low guard and you're fighting them with sword and targa, you should watch their hand. He says that you should watch their sword hand. And this is another sort of piece that came from that whole lecture. Is most of the Bolognese masters tell you to watch your opponent's sword hand. And the reason why Marozzo says with the sword and targa is that if they're going to deliver a cut, they're going to have to raise their hand, which is a tempo. It's a tempo of attack in Giovanni dall'Agocchie. And or they're going to have to pull their hand back in order to deliver a thrust, is what Marozzo says. And so taking that and thinking about it, Manciolino is kind of giving you this really interesting idea that if you can constrain your opponent when they're in a low guard, if you can step into measure when your opponent assumes a low guard as they're transitioning between different guards, you can basically trap them so that way their intentions are very limited, like their good attacks are limited. And then you look at that from his tactical framework overall, and that's basically how he plays it out. Now, the thing is then when I had sort of made this realization and really kind of understood this, I went back to Vigiani and I was like, damn it, Vigiani, you are a genius. Like you have all these things. And really, I didn't have to go through that entire thought process. Vigiani had already done it for me. And I love it. I love what Vigiani has done. And I think that he is probably the most important source, mostly because it's not just he has a great disposition on the guards. He has a great disposition on what tempo is and how to understand tempo.
Yeah, and isn't it cool how he even tells us how to parry, beating the sword away from you like you're actually afraid of it, and he bangs on about why it's dangerous to train with blunt swords because it basically teaches you to be complacent about your opponent's weapon.
Yes, absolutely.
That's not how he phrases it, but
yeah.
Whenever anybody has a go at me for doing exercise, training with sharp swords, I'm like, Vigiani, dude.
So yeah, and the third thing that I was thinking about is actually the turns of the body, the postures and the body mechanics. The way that he describes body mechanics is brilliant.
Yes, and that turning of the hips that brings up the back heel, and then when you've read Vigiani and you go back and look at Fiore again, it's like, holy shit, there it is.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing. So, this whole thing kind of was in the process of when I was looking at Fiore, and the the first thing, watching Kurt go through and do the Fiore postures and the mezzovolta and things like that, I was like, holy crap, that kind of reminds me of Vigiani a little bit. So I went and I grabbed my copy of Vigiani. I was like, oh,
yeah. There it is. Yeah,
body mechanic and postures. I mean, and it's just, there's a lot of really great stuff in there. Yeah.
There is. And credit where it's due. If I recall correctly, it was Bob Sharon when he came to Finland in 2003 to do a seminar for me, or possibly it was 2005. I think it was early. I think it was 2003. That he was the one who put me onto Vigiani. He says, like, Guy, you've got to read Vigiani. I'm like, Vigi who? What? And he said, and I had a look. I was like, holy shit, Bob, you were right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's okay. So, do you think Vigiani actually trained in the Bolognese system?
I do. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean,
and then modified to. I mean, his schermo is like it is one action, right?
It is. Yeah, but it's also
a zip file for fencing.
It is, but it's also basically the exact same advice that Giovanni dall'Agocchie gives for his how to prepare for a duel in 20 days or 30 days.
Right, and it is the same as, or very, very similar to Fiore's plays of the sword in one hand, and it's similar to the falling under against half shield in 133. And at the end of Capoferro, he says that in Capoferro's Grand Simulacro, there is a chapter which is the secure way to defend yourself against any sort of blow. And guess what? You wait in a low guard, and when somebody attacks over your sword, as that's the only place they can attack because your sword is down and to the left, right? You beat it up into prima and then you stab them with a without lunge. It's Vigiani.
Right.
Just pure, unadulterated Vigiani.
So, and Marozzo, I mean, it's kind of, there's, in a way, it almost represents probably like this common approach to sword fighting. And this might be sort of the common fencing of Italian fencing. Is a lot of times, even Marozzo refers to rising and falling. Manciolino refers to rising and falling. As actions that you should do. And I mean, it's basically false edge, come back with an attack, whether it's a thrust or a cut. I mean, and you see it throughout all of these different Italian systems. You're constantly coming up underneath your false edge and then coming back down. So
right, and this is incidentally why I think that the Lichtenauer, sort of the Lichtenauer settled of the verses and the Meisterhau and what have you, are like the advanced course. Because you see that in the Messer sources, but you don't see it in the Lichtenauerian longsword sources because, well, everybody knows that stuff already. It's my view. That's my opinion, and some people agree with me and some people don't. But to my mind, a system that doesn't have you starting in a low guard on your left and parrying everything that comes at you with a rising blow, is probably missing something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's, you know, I was just thinking about it. It's in Palladini too. In Palladini's, he actually sticks it in his cut section, but he tells you that you can do it with a thrust. You can deliver an impercata. So,
and if you think about it, it's you know, if you're holding a small sword and you're on guard in cart and somebody thrusts over the arm, you parry with a false edge and thrust, and it's not necessarily the first technique, and it's not the universal technique necessarily. But that basic kind of false edge parry from the left and then you strike, it's everywhere.
So, Guy, Palladini gives one of the coolest counters to that. And
Go on, tell me.
Man, like when I started studying Palladini and I got into this parry of this play, I was like, oh my God, like this is the most beautiful thing ever. Because it doesn't seem like it could work. Basically, when somebody comes up with that false edge and they start to turn their sword over to deliver that thrust, he says to turn your flat over their sword, basically go into guardia di faccia, right? So you push down their sword with the flat, and it'll basically set their sword completely off and put the point right on their face, right? So that's sort of the initial setup to the play. It doesn't feel like it should work, right? You're on the other side. They've got your false edge coming up, and you go up with the flat of your sword and just kind of have your sword fully extended in front of your face. And then once you're in that position of leverage, then you just take a step back with your back foot and let your hand drop, and it just puts the point right in their chest. And it is the most beautiful thing ever. It is so,
Have you got
so
it on
awesome.
video?
I will. We're working on.
Get it on video for me, and send me the video, or send me a link, and I'll put it in the show notes. And this isn't going out till like February, so you have a bit of time.
Okay.
We're recording this in October.
Definitely.
I'm way ahead on my podcast recording at the moment.
I will.
Right.
I
So
will.
you have some time, but do not let the listeners down, sir.
I won't. It's beautiful though.
If he fails to get the video to me before this episode goes out, listeners, email me and I will forward your complaints to Josh. I promise you.
Duly noted.
I mean, I wouldn't dox you and give out your email address or anything on that. That would be wrong. But I will forward the complaint.
All right.
Fair?
Fair. Absolutely
Brilliant.
fair.
Okay. Speaking of listeners, you have a podcast, L'Arte dell'Armi, okay, which is the Italian for the art of arms. Mm-hmm. So, tell us a bit about your podcast, because I'm fairly sure that some of the people who listen to this show are quite interested in podcasts about sword stuff.
Yeah. So, I started the podcast because I love, when the pandemic hit, we kind of lost the sense of community that you get from going to events and getting to sit down with other sword people and have those conversations over drinks or something like that after an event. That, I was like, I want to get that back, and I want to start engaging in these conversations again, because I feel like I've always learned so much from sitting down and just listening to those conversations. Like the conversations that happened at Lord Baltimore's challenge were incredible. Right. I was sitting at a table with Mike Pendergast and Devin Borman, and just listening to them go back and forth, and I was just like, this is what world do I live in right now? But to get these conversations going where you have this exchange of ideas, I think is so important. It's one of those things where I think it's a really great way to learn. And then obviously, like, the long form version of a podcast allows you to really kind of get those ideas out there for people to really kind of hone in and explain those things. And with the Bolognese system in particular, it's growing. For the longest time, Ilka was basically like, he's like the godfather of...
Let me tell you a story about Ilka, right? Okay. I think it was 2006, thereabouts. I was about to get into the Bolognese stuff. And Ilka was studying with me, had been for some years, and was working towards his assistant instructor's exam, right? And one of the things you have to do for that is to present your own interpretation of a historical fencing system from sources. And he fell in love with the Bolognese a bit before this, and he said, right, he wanted to do Bolognese, right? And so I stopped doing my Bolognese research, because what I was expecting to happen was Ilka would then, do his exam, what have you, which he did, and he passed it, flying colours, and then he would basically kind of do the Bolognese program for the school. Didn't quite work out that way. He ended up starting his own thing with some other people. But it was like, if Ilka hadn't have gotten into Bolognese, I would have done. I only held back from diving into the Bolognese because I was leaving the field open for Ilka so that he could. Because the problem is, when you're the teacher, it's very easy for your students to kind of pick up your prejudices and your preconceptions and your biases and what have you. And I wanted him to come at it without any instruction from me. Instruction in like research practice and how to write an essay and stuff like that, but not actual in the Bolognese stuff itself.
Yeah.
And so I'm very, very glad that he really did run with it, because if he hadn't have done it, I would probably be teaching Bolognese seminars now.
Well, so much of the material that he produced ended up was, I think, a catalyst for a lot of people.
Sure.
Kind of going back to the question of why the Bolognese system, one of the great things about Bolognese in general is that you have kata, right? You have forms that you can do. And I, through my fencing career, going out and fighting, people have always sort of been like, one of the observations people will make when they've seen me fence, they're like, man, your footwork and your control is like exceptional. And I'm like, yeah. They're like, how do you do it? Well, I do forms for an hour, 2 hours a day, almost every day.
That'll do it.
That'll do it, right?
Yeah. I get this so much. People are like, oh, forms are stupid. Oh, forms only work if your attacker happens to follow the form exactly, and blah, blah, blah. I had the same conversation with Manusha, Dr. Manusha Khorasani. He, on this podcast, I don't know if you listened to that one, but he's like, yeah, and those same people who complain about follow forms of crap do forms, they just call them something else.
Yeah.
Like, they call them like combinations, or they do very short forms, like, jab, jab, straight punch, or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah.
It's an interesting way. I mean, I tell people all the time, it's the coolest way to work out ever. It's the best workout that you can possibly imagine. Just go out in a field. Sometimes I'll put some music on and go out there and just go through all these forms. And
what music?
I'm a bit of a metalhead. So
that's okay.
usually it's some form of heavy metal, but sometimes I'll listen to classical music. My instructor, Chris Nolan, he our head instructor for the Bolognese system, he loves to listen to the Nutcracker.
Okay.
He says that if you pair the Nutcracker with Marozzo's forms, it actually has a really awesome flow. So he'll listen, he'll do everything in tempo, and then he'll go back and he'll choose the time when he's going to break the tempo. And it's really easy because it's in a standard timing. Yeah. So, there are different ways to go about it, right? You can make this really dynamic. You can sort of add different elements into what you're doing. But, that's one of the things that I love about the Bolognese system is that it's really fun to practice. You can take this practice into a lot of different areas. But so much of that comes from what Ilko was doing, where, he taught the forms, and that's basically what a lot of people in the Bolognese community knew of the Bolognese system, because we didn't really have the treatises yet. I mean, we had Manciolino from Tom Leone's translation, and that was basically it. What we knew of Marozzo really kind of came from Ilka and the work that he had done. And because the translation that was on Wichtenauer is not the best, but when you finally had this series of publications and the Jurek Swanger doing the Lord's work and getting all of these treatises translated,
Jurek's a great guy.
It's created this explosion of understanding of the Bolognese system. So when I say that we're relatively, we're starting to figure things out, right? And so one of the important things about having the podcast is that as we're in the process of figuring these things out, having these conversations about the things that we don't understand or that we are trying to figure out helps to, or at least I hope it helps to kind of bring these things to the forefront and allow people to sort of listen to what other people are thinking, pull those things in, and then start to explore them themselves. So, and not only that, but there are also aspects of the Bolognese system that I knew that I would never get a chance to explore. So, one of the episodes I talked to Eric Weiss, who's down in Dallas, and Eric is a Bolognese practitioner, but he was also a jouster. He was in, he jousted in medieval times, and it was really cool. So I was like, Eric, what we need to do is we need to sit down. We need to take Giovanni dall'Agocchie's chapter on jousting and let's break it down bit by bit. And then let's take Marozzo's advice for what to do when you're fighting somebody on horseback and you just have a sword and a cape. And let's talk about that, because you've actually had somebody ride you down on a horse and you've had to jump out of the way. So let's talk about what that actually means. What does that feel like? What does it feel like to get that timing right?
Yeah.
So those are the things that I really wanted to explore. I think the next episode that I'm going to do, I'm talking to Reese Nelson, who's does a fantastic podcast on armor. Another sort of gateway thing that a lot of people aren't going to do is get a suit of armor, though they should.
Yeah, they should, but 30 grand.
I know it's not
grand.
easy. Yeah, it's not easy.
Yeah, it's for a lot of people. It's just not approachable.
It's not possible, right? And so in the next episode, we're going to walk through all of the anonymous poleaxe and armor plays. And
cool.
I want them to talk about the limitations of armor. We've got a group at our school that's really starting to get into armor, and some of their observations about things that you can and can't do in armor are incredibly fascinating. Like, your arms don't quite move the same. You can't really lift your arm up over your shoulder, depending on what kind of kit you're wearing.
Well, okay, if you've got good armor, you should be able to put your hands together over your head.
Oh, okay.
And we know this. If you think of, like, look at Fiore's sword in armor guards.
Yeah.
He has a guard where you're holding the sword over your head.
Yeah.
Right? In armor.
But the limitation, I think, is more in the bend of the elbow, where you can't quite get your arm all the way back, right?
Okay, my armor.
Uh-huh.
I without armor, I'm keeping my wrist straight. There's about 4 inches between the knuckles of my hand and my shoulder. I can press that down or bend my wrist to get it in contact, but keeping the wrist straight is about 4 inches. In armor, I would say it's probably about 5 inches.
Gotcha. So it's not that much of a difference.
Yeah, but you know, the armor needs to be tailor-made.
Yeah.
And it needs to, because the treatises are written for people who really are rich, and armored combat is their job, right?
Yeah.
And so they are. The expectation is you are wearing tailor-made armor that works really well, and it's like, if you have a treatise on driving a car, and so let's say a treatise on stunt driving, right? They will expect you, if you're taking the stunt driving course with your car, they will probably expect you to have a certain kind of quality of car, right? That
that makes perfect sense.
It's
yeah.
So I think a lot of the limitations that we get with modern armor is because the armor that people are getting off the shelf or whatever, it may be fairly accurate in terms of, well, there's a lot of people in medieval times who wore armor that didn't fit properly because they stripped it off a corpse or bought it in a market or got it second hand from their mate when they were playing dice, and all right, okay, I'll bet you my whatchamacallit against your arm armor because it almost fits me, right? That there's a lot of that going on, but I think for the treatises that we're looking at, the expectation is that the armor was made for you and it was made to a really high standard.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, but there are some overall limitations of what you can and can't do. There are also certain ideas that exist in armor. Like measure, for example, is going to be closer when you're in armor. And so you have these sort of inherent things that exist where I feel like you could create either not necessarily bad habits or just kind of misunderstandings of things if you were to go and you were to look at the Anonimo, for example, with his poleaxe and armor. So to try to understand those things, what are the considerations that you need to make as you're exploring these different things if you don't have that experience of doing that thing the way it should be done?
Right.
So,
All right, so your podcast is basically kind of deep dives on specific topics.
Yeah, so sometimes it's deep dives on specific topics. Sometimes it's kind of really just kind of highlighting the practitioners that are out there in the Bolognese community, kind of letting them get their ideas out there. So, I've talked to all sorts of people that, asked them about a lot of times I'll just ask them ahead of time, like, what's your focus? Like, what are you really interested in? And let's do a deep dive on it. Let's just amplify those people's voices so that way they get out there, and then people can hear that and say, okay, I like that, I don't like that, I agree with that, I don't agree, and so on.
One of my sort of principles for my show is I hope that about 10% of the listenership love every episode. A different 10% for each episode, perhaps, or overlapping 10%, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. But I'm not trying to please everyone. So I'm not trying to make a kind of general interest show. I expect people to have their favourites, and you know, I know exactly. I can think of at least 2 or 3 people who are going to be extremely excited about this episode, right? Not least because at least one person actually emailed me and said, "Guy, you've got to get Joshua Wiest on because he's like, Bolognese, do that," right? So, and that's better than just trying to please the general audience, I think.
But the cool thing, Guy, and I've got to say this because I am an avid listener of your podcast, and it's funny because like when you asked me to come on here and do this podcast, I was like, man, I've stolen more ideas from Guy's podcast because you've given me some great ideas, like the barefoot walking and barefoot shoes. Like I was like, I'm sold. I'm going to give this a shot, and I converted completely to barefoot shoes. Even the shoes that I wear at work now are all barefoot shoes.
Excellent.
We had an event, and this I guess will be in February, back in October, called October Effect, and I got a dancing instructor to come out, a historical dancing instructor to teach us how.
Fantastic!
And all of these ideas have come from your podcast, where I hear all these.
I'm not at all sorry.
No, and you shouldn't be. I mean, it's fantastic, but I think that level of learning and, you know, just hearing, like I said, hearing different ideas, hearing different voices, and sort of co-opting some of those ideas and bringing them into your own practice and study. I mean, it just makes you such a more well-rounded and proficient practitioner. So I love it.
I agree. Yeah. So it's Katie Bowman's episode that converted you to barefoot shoes.
It was. Yeah, she got me.
Yeah, she's fantastic. I love Katie. That was a funny story actually, because Katie's like quite high powered and difficult to get hold of. So you don't email her directly. You email her assistant, who decides whether or not to send it on.
It is power.
Right. Yeah. And it was extraordinary. So I'm a barefoot shoe person or whatever, and Jessica Finley suggested Katie Bowman would be great for the podcast, and actually my assistant Katie, who actually does all the kind of the work for the podcast, like transcriptions and uploading everything, and the podcast would not exist without her. So she was like, get Katie Bowman on. Yeah, Katie Bowman's fat. So I approached her, and within like 12 hours, given the time distance, that's extraordinary, I got this email back like, hell yes! Like, with a picture of Katie herself holding a sword, because apparently her son is like 10, I think. Is like mad about swords. So
that's awesome.
That went really well. Who got you into the dancing?
I can't remember the lady's name. You were talking to somebody who did Elizabethan recreation.
Yes, Ruth.
And I think is that the one she was talking about cooking as well. But you guys went on this long conversation about dance and how dance was so important. And I was like,
yeah,
you know what?
That's Ruth Goodman.
Yep.
Episode 44.
That was
she's fab.
Yeah, that was great. And so I went out. I found one of the best historical dance instructors in the U.S. and we brought her out for an event. And you know what?
Fantastic.
Everybody loved it. It was incredible. So
who was it?
It was her name is Jeanette Watts.
Jeanette Watts. Okay,
yep.
Maybe I should approach her for the show, perhaps.
Oh yeah. I think that would be. I'll send you her information. She's fantastic.
Yeah. Yep. And the funny thing about these deep dives, like one of the most popular episodes of the last little while was with Cornelius Berthold, which wasn't even a proper podcast episode. I didn't actually really interview him. He had some questions about Capoferro's tempo, and we ended up having this great long, very geeky discussion about tempo. And it got maybe 50% more listens in the first 2 weeks than the average. It's like, okay, people are really into the deep dive stuff. Good.
Yeah. I mean, it's weird because like for my podcast, it started more as just kind of highlighting the individuals and having those conversations. And then the deep dive started happening more and more because I think people were really interested in just kind of like getting, everybody has something they're passionate about. Right. Some people want to really, like my passion right now, the thing that I'm really kind of getting into is this whole like thing about the guards and like really trying to understand what they convey tactically. And I could talk about it for hours, and other people, it might be, tempo. And I'd love to talk about tempo, when I had Devin Borman on there, we talked about what it was like to sort of train your students and really kind of build them up and create like a good structure around like how to sort of take your students from like a intermediate level to an advanced level. And to get his perspective on that was really great because, he's trained a lot of fencers. Right. And so, it's all over the place and it's good stuff.
Brilliant. Okay. So, as a listener of the show, you know what's coming.
Yeah.
All right. Tell us, what is the best idea you haven't acted on?
So, this is a tough one because I actually have quite a few like good ideas that I've never acted on. I've never been to Europe, which is,
shocking.
It is shocking. I need to get over there. But I feel like because I have such a curious and inquisitive mind, I have so many things that I will think about and I'll think, I need to really explore that and try to understand that. And then I'll kind of put it in a box because it doesn't necessarily fit with what I'm doing at the moment.
Okay.
Studying rapier, I think is actually one of the things that I have would be is the most brilliant thing that I haven't acted on because I feel like it would be so much fun and I would love to do it, but I haven't done it. And it's just like I even have all the treatises and they're just like sitting on my shelf staring at me and just like, staring deep into my eyes. And I've been stuck in this 16th century world and I haven't quite taken that step into the 17th century. I've dabbled a little bit, like Palladini's like as close as you can get. So, he's like my gateway and into eventually making that transition. But that's probably the one that I haven't done quite so much.
Okay, so you should definitely study rapier. The thing is, to my mind, rapier's because it emphasizes a particular kind of play, not to the exclusion of all others, but it really focuses on sort of point control and blade relationship, and it does all of that really specifically. You can take that understanding and apply it to any other system you study.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and without even without cross-contaminating it. It just gives you an insight into blade relationship that you won't get anywhere else, I don't think.
Yeah.
Small sword people are jumping up and down in the back going, small sword? Yeah, but it's different with small sword.
So it's actually really interesting because like I feel like dall'Agocchie actually kind of references this a little bit in his treatise where he talks about how the fencing of his day is less or is narrow and it's primarily narrow. And then again you look at his guards and basically the guards of dall'Agocchie, he gives you save Cinquiari Porta de Ferro. He basically condenses the Bolognese guards down to prima, seconda, terza, and quarta. Right? Cordia de Alicorno, Codalonga Stretta, Porta de Ferro Stretta.
Yeah.
And that's his entire system. Yeah.
Right.
So
he's getting towards rapier.
He is, yeah. And then Palladini basically has made that conversion. He uses the Roman system and the names of his guards. Speaking of people talking smack about other fencing instructors, he talks mad smack about Agrippa, which is pretty great.
So if I remember rightly, I think Agrippa is Camillo Agrippa, 1553. Mm-hmm. He was the first person to number guards, wasn't he?
Yep.
Yeah, but not strictly a Bolognese person.
No. So Agrippa kind of came up with his own system and really kind of introduced the lunge as like sort of the primary motive for driving the point. And the criticism from Palladini is actually that He doesn't like the lunge. He thinks it's dangerous. He says you would never do it on a field that's with like uneven ground. And so what he advises instead, or at least what he primarily does in his system, is he does a left foot pass.
Right.
So because it says it's safer.
Okay, so there's an awful lot of work to be done, I think, putting Agrippa into a proper relationship with the Bolognese, because there's no way he was unaware of it.
No, for sure, absolutely. I'm not. So this is where the whole like Northern Italian sort of system comes from. Like, I would love for somebody to produce a translation of, or at least my Italian to get good enough where I could really start getting into Altoni, and looking at the Florentine system and how it relates, because we have all these like similarities and these commonalities between the different things. Like, one of my favorite systems to study in the Bolognese system and outside of the Bolognese system is two swords. Two swords is by far one of the most challenging and tactically interesting approaches to how to fight, because you have two weapons that are both good at offense and defense, and there are clear differences. Like, if you look at Agrippa, his two sword system is very similar to what Altoni and Docciolini do.
Well,
and even Palladini.
Agrippa says that you should use the sword in your left hand as if it was a dagger and just parry with it and hit with the other one, as I recall.
Yes.
As I recall.
No. You're right.
Wrong.
You're right. So I'm thinking from a stance, like a general guard perspective. So one of the things you see with Palladini, where he always has one sword high and one sword low. Docciolini and Altoni do the same thing. Where if you look at Marozzo and Manciolino, both of them generally keep the swords on the same side. And they keep them relatively close together. So with Manciolino in particular, you have one sword that's in Guardia di Testa and another sword that's in Porta di Ferro, or a mirror of that on the other side. And with Marozzo, you usually have both points forward, which is pretty curious because Palladini...
Or Agrippa? So Agrippa doesn't...
Marozzo
doesn't do... So Marozzo does two swords as well?
He does, yep.
Okay, so I must have skipped that bit, because I'm actually... Okay, this is like my favourite kind of conversation, where I now have like four open books around me, and I just went to get number 5, which is Ken Monshin's translation of Agrippa, and I was just digging through it to have a look at his two sword guards. It's chapter 17, page 87 of because I was just making sure that it's been a while since I've read it, so I was making sure I was right about the holding the sword in. The sword in your left hand is the one that you parry with.
Yeah.
Well, I should keep his left hand sword free as he traverses, so that he can parry the enemy's weapons. And he should do all this in one time.
So that's basically Marozzo. I think Marozzo never says that's... Well, he kind of does. So he says you come up underneath and you find their sword on the first or second play. But the way that Marozzo approaches it, and I think this is the safe approach, is that you're always covering one of your opponent's swords. You're trying to get to a specific line. So whether you're always working to the outside of a sword, right? So
yes.
you can get to the outside of a specific line, and you can go ahead and start to initiate your attack. What Marozzo likes to do is find your opponent's left sword and then throw a falso to the hand on that side and force them to parry, and then he sort of transitions through the plays that way. Interesting of note, Marozzo's 8th play with two swords actually really looks like, if you do this in practice, and I know people have different interpretations, the interpretation that seemed most logical to me looks exactly like what ends up happening in the painting The Duel of the Century, where you have Ascanio fighting Giovanni Tatti in Florence in that famous two-sword duel where they closed off the city of Florence and had 10,000 spectators or something like that, and they're all watching this two-sword duel, and Ascanio ends up killing Giovanni Tatti. But Tatti was a part of the Florentine system, so he had studied in that general system without perhaps a student of Altoni, or perhaps Altoni himself. And we know that Ascanio studied the Bolognese system. So here we have another famous anecdote. And so it kind of looks like he's doing Marozzo's eighth play. And that's where
okay.
Yeah.
You have send me a link for that picture, and I'll put the picture in the show notes.
I will.
So that people can find it, because
I will.
There's a lot of Italian terms there that otherwise have to spell right to Google it and find it themselves.
Yeah,
this is going to be a very long set of show notes. That's going to be great.
Yeah,
it's good.
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's good.
The interesting thing about it is, so in certain two-sword systems, you'll have one sword high and one sword low. And I think that's kind of how Agrippa approaches it. That's how Altoni and Docciolini approach it. And that's how Palladini approaches it. Where with Marozzo, he keeps them low. And one of the interesting things that Palladini says is that you would want to do that because you always have one sword attacking. Like your high sword, again, kind of going back to that whole thing, your high sword is the one that attacks, and it goes low. And as you attack, you basically turn your body back across. So your low sword that was parrying now becomes your offensive sword. And you kind of have this like arms rotating back and forth in this like swinging, like sort of a pendulum type way. And that's kind of the framework of their system. Now, Marozzo is completely different. He likes to come up underneath and kind of attack and like come over and stuff like that. And Manciolino is very similar. But the Palladini gives this weird anecdote where he talks about when you're fighting with two swords, you only bring the two swords together where both points are forward if you're fighting somebody with a two-handed sword.
Okay.
Just really weird, interesting piece of advice.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah, because then you can cover and come straight through with your offense.
You need to cover with both hands.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about a two-handed sword. Like that's a big weapon. And it hits really hard if you're not careful. So
exactly.
If you're going to cover it, you need to cover it with both hands at once, and then probably keep it with one and free the other sword to strike. Huh.
Yeah, Palladini gives some really cool stuff in terms of like just these really odd anecdotes. Like he tells you that he actually advises that your students learn how to fight, obviously with both hands, right? Right-handed, left-handed, and then they learn two swords as their second, like that's their second study, and then they learn sword and dagger.
But practically nobody carried two swords.
Right, so he gives an anecdote about that, and that's the other one that I was going to get to. He tells you that if you have a second or if you have a page, they should always carry a sword, not for their own defense, but to hand you the sword, so that way if you ever get jumped in the street, you have two swords.
I think I would rather hide behind the page and let him deal with it. I mean, come on.
Yep.
But that is fascinating. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So the best idea you've ever acted on is to learn rapier, but then we go off on a great long riff about two swords at once. Actually, it's a question I get asked a lot. And the thing is, we don't have very many accounts of duels fought with two swords. So, and I'm more of a sort of sidearm person rather than a specialised dueling system person. So I've never really looked into it that much. But a lot of people are curious about it because it's very flashy and cool. Anyway,
it is, and it's fun.
Okay, somebody gives you $1 million. Now, you've listened to the podcast, so you've had time to prepare this. We are expecting great things from you, Joshua. Great things. Somebody gives you $1 million, whatever, to spend improving historical martial arts worldwide. How do you spend the money?
I would take a team of scholars, and I would lock them in every library and private collection in Europe and have them scour and find all of the treatises that we can't find.
Okay, so you would put the money towards finding more treatises, finding more sources.
Yep. So like Tom Leone's, because I think that there are data points that we can start to find and understand that are going to be more beneficial to our development of historical European martial arts. I think one of the most important books that's come out on fencing in the last 5 or 6 years is...
You better say one of mine, mate. You better say one of mine.
No, I mean, yours are... your books are fantastic, but
Sorry.
In terms of historical sources, not.
No, I know. I was teasing.
I know. Is the anonymous Vienna?
Oh yes! Oh my God!
Because
What a hell of a
we're
book.
actually getting the perspective of the student, and a student
Just
writing
tell
the
everyone what
notes
it is.
of the master. So the anonymous Vienna is it's basically a compilation of notes where there was a student of fencing in Germany who compiled notes from Fabris, Capoferro, and there's one that I'm forgetting. Who's the third one, Guy?
I should know. You're right to call me out, and I forgot. It's been a little while since I read it. But yes, it's most of them are Fabris and a bit of Capoferro. I mean,
Yeah,
Giganti would be
and
the
so-
obvious third one, but I don't think it's Giganti.
I don't think so, but yeah, he's basically just a student of rapier, and so he's writing all these notes. He's writing comparisons between the different systems, and he's writing out all these ideas, and he's in detail describing the footwork where the masters or the actual authors themselves might be kind of scant on the details of footwork and things like that. This guy writes notes on footwork like it's something that he's learning, and from a learner's perspective, from a scholar's
useful.
perspective, it's incredibly useful. Like that's what we need. Like, and those treatises exist. Like when I was talking to Marino De Ricci, he said that they found something in Brescia that they're going to be publishing soon, where again you have this treatise from like the mid 16th century that's written from the perspective of a student, where they hired some unknown fencing master to come in and teach them fencing, and they just basically jotted down a bunch of notes, and it's their notes. It's not the fencing master's notes. It's their personal notes. And I feel like those are out there. And if we could get through a lot of these archives, which are dense, we can start to get some of those ideas, or we might find something like De Luca's or Darty. I think it's Darty that wrote a treatise on fencing and mathematics, right? And that's probably in a library somewhere in Bologna or in a private collection. And if we could get that, we would learn so much. It could be lost to time. Who knows? But they're definitely out there somewhere. There's a treatise that's going to just blow everybody's mind, just sitting collecting dust. And that breaks my heart.
Okay, that's not a bad use of the money. It's funny because you're relatively young, I think, and you probably don't remember what it was like 20 years ago in historical martial arts, or 25 years ago, where a dodgy photocopy, 5th generation photocopy, of half of a manuscript was considered like gold.
Yeah.
Right? We had no Wiktenau, we had no published facsimiles, we had no translations, we had none of that stuff. And so now I look at Wiktenau and there are hundreds of sources that you can download in high resolution, and it's free. So from that perspective, the notion of wanting more original sources is like, really? Look at how many we've already got. It's like, but I guess but your point about the Viennese manuscript is well made. It's like it doesn't necessarily even have to be these sources, sort of treatises written by historical fencing masters. The students' notes are a fascinating insight into how they were thinking and what they were struggling with, and like they're basically providing glosses. Mm-hmm. Right? Then when you think about it, like most of what we know about Lichtenau's actually doing Lichtenau's longsword stuff doesn't come from Lichtenau's writings. It comes from glosses written effectively by students explaining Lichtenau's writing.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. Yeah. If I had the money, I'd give it to you.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, like the Anonimo Bolognese in particular, just like it blows my mind at times with the sort of the expansiveness of it. I mean, obviously you have somebody that really loved the single-handed sword enough that he did like 640 something plays. It's a massive tome that I will never be able to complete right? There's already so much material out there to study that it's impossible to get through all of it in a lifetime, right? I would have to live at least 2 lifetimes to cover all this stuff. But there are perspectives in there that are brilliant. And every once in a while you come across something that just kind of like sticks with you. Like the Anonymous says this one thing where he says, also you must know that if your enemy is in wide guard, then you use your art to bring his sword into presence. If he has his sword in presence, then by means of feinting, make him bring his sword into a wide guard that allows you to control the line, such that the sword will point away from your person and off to the side of your body so that you'll be able to perform whatever actions you wish. And that is like literally the perfect summation of fencing that I have ever heard. Like it's pristine.
Control his weapon. Yeah. Control the weapon.
And control the line. And it's like, yeah. And it's
Genius.
like, I wish I want to tattoo that on every Bolognese fencer's palm so they can just always have it there and just like, check their palm. What am I doing? My fencing isn't really working right now. Wait, let me take my glove off. Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Now I got it. Let's go.
So actually, really, we should spend the money setting up mobile tattoo parlors where all Bolognese fencers have to report before they're allowed to call themselves a Bolognese fencer. They have to report and have this tattooed on their hand.
That's right.
Honestly, I think it should be in both Italian and in translation.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we can do Italian on the right hand, so that way, or on the left hand, so it's close to the heart, and then we'll do whatever language is their native language on their right hand.
I think we've nailed it. Oh, brilliant! Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Joshua. It's been lovely getting to know you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure, Guy. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. You can find the episode show notes at swordschool.com/podcast, where you'll find transcriptions, photos, videos, and links for this episode. You can find a direct link to the show notes for this episode in the description. Join us next week for another cracking conversation. See you then.